first of all, so my name is Lou. I work for a company called Gitpod. We'll talk a little bit about Gitpod towards the end of the workshop, but the real sort of bulk of the workshop will be talking about development containers. Would love to know as well, like drop in the chat, levels of familiarity. If you've heard of Dev Container before, if you're using it, that kind of thing would be interesting to know sort of where you're at, or if maybe it's the first time you're hearing it today, that would be also useful to sort of know as well. So on the learning curve, oh, Patrick's on the learning curve. We're all on the learning curve. Heard of it. Wonderful. Right. So in terms of agenda, basically what we'll do is I'll give you a quick overview. So I'll try to keep that as short as I can, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then what we're going to do is jump into two sort of hands-on tasks. First will be sort of exploring the basics, where I would suggest that we take an existing repository, a blank configuration, and just start to play around with the ergonomics of Dev Container and see how it works. And then from there, what I would suggest that we do is we move into taking on potentially one of your own repositories or an open source repository of your own, and then we can get a little bit more advanced with what Dev Container can do. So Alan says, hasn't heard of it, has used Gitpod. Depending on which version of Gitpod, then you've used Dev Container. The latest version is built on top of it. So wonderful. And then we'll get into actually converting one of your own repositories. And then finally, we'll just talk a little bit about CDEs, and effectively they are supercharging Dev Container on top of it. So if you like what we're doing as we go through the Dev Container stuff, you might be interested in what CDEs do as well on top of Dev Container as well. But let's go ahead and jump in then. So here's my sort of overview of the goals for the workshop today, so you can keep me accountable here. So what I'd love if you all leave this workshop is really an understanding of the core features of Dev Container. Of course, it's difficult to understand everything in the short sort of 90 minutes we have today, but I would love for you to feel very confident and motivated to use Dev Container on your next project. Maybe when you start up and start working on a new project, that you reach for Dev Container because it feels familiar and you've got that sort of base level of knowledge to do so. And it would be great as well for most of you if we end up with a head start. So actually configuring a real repository that you will use. Now it's up to you. You can use one of your own repositories. It could be something from work, or it could be a personal one, or sort of a hobby project, something like that. Or you can even start from scratch if you want. But it'd be great if you leave this workshop with a head start on a configuration of your own as well. And then finally, just an understanding of what you can do next. So once you've got your Dev Container up and running, sort of what you can do to supercharge it and sort of take it to the next level, and some best practices. So I'll just have a quick look through the chat again. So if it translates to deployments as well as local env setup, yes, we'll definitely talk a little bit about that as well. Full end-to-end setup. Wonderful. That's definitely, we'll touch on some of those aspects as well. Right, so before we get into the what of Dev Container, I suppose we should start with the why. So why does Dev Container exist? What problems is Dev Container trying to solve for us? So primarily, and obviously related to the title of this workshop, is we're trying to eliminate the works on my machine issues, which if you are a professional developer, you've certainly bumped into time to time, where environments have drifted. So that could be your environment drifted from a higher environment, or from one of your colleagues, a developer, or someone testing out your work, where something has changed. Now, Docker and the ideas of a mutable infrastructure as code has been very prominent for quite some time. I think Docker came out in 2014? Around that time. So it's been well over 10 years that we've been, sort of working with containers in production, and many, many companies around the world are using containers for their production workload. So it begs the question, which is, why don't we just do that also for our local machines? Why do we put up with mutable, broken environments? And the answer is that we don't have to. So Dev Container gives us a really nice utility belt for solving some of those works on my machine issues as well. And then as a platform perspective, that also helps us out with onboarding. A common problem for many organizations is developer onboarding. We run a lot of surveys with our own customers, and it's very common that we see that a lot of organizations are spending a lot more time on developers struggling with broken environments than they realize. It's often quite a silent sort of problem that exists behind the scenes. But if you're, a platform team that's doing surveys inside of your ecosystem, this could well be one of those places that you're potentially sinking a lot of developer time, so worth having a look at. This is also looking at tackling things like dependency conflicts. We'll get into that. And also standardization. As platform teams, one of our sort of core goals is to try and bring standardization to our teams. So giving them a golden path and a set of configurations, keep things standard, and then we can improve and level up the developer productivity, the security, and things like that across all the different teams in our organization. Now, linked a little bit, I guess, to Siddharth's question in the chat, which is development basically equaling CI and then ultimately equaling production. So development container is a little bit less for production, but certainly very much for development. But it can also be used in your continuous integration as well. So you can reuse some of these configurations using the dev container CLI and some GitHub Actions workflows, which we can talk a little bit about later. Which is great because then your CI, your development environment, and everything is all in sync. Cool. So I just want to touch on the state of adoption. It's really important when you're adopting a new tool to understand, well, how widely adopted is this? How successful is it sort of out there in the ecosystem? So I've just grabbed a couple of numbers that give you an indication of where sort of dev container is at. And the specification itself has several thousand stars on GitHub, but it is a specification, so it's not overly interesting necessarily. But we've got over 32 million downloads from VS Code, which gives you a good indication of how many developers are actively using dev containers in their day-to-day. And the CLI having 100,000 downloads, which is effectively using dev container, probably more likely in CI or in automation as well. But then through the CLI that dev container has, that actually creates an abstraction that you have for vendors or internal tools. So if you're building internally to your company something that you want to standardize for your development environment, so you want to standardize your developers throughout CI, you can actually do that on top of the dev container CLI. And that's exactly what we basically did here at Gitpod. We'll talk a bit about that later. But also, CodeSpaces as well is a very prominent tool from GitHub, deeply integrated to the dev container specification. And there's many other vendors out there as well that have also aligned with the standard. If you go to these dev containers, containers.dev/supporting, you get a full list of some of the other participating vendors as well within the standard. So before we get into the deep dives of the specifics, I do want to just mention that throughout today, if you go to containers.dev, there's some really great information on there. It's very comprehensive documentation about the dev container standard. But then also, if you go to github.com/devcontainers, there's actually an org on GitHub. And you can see within there, you've got a repository for the spec, for the CLI, for the images used in dev container, templates, features, and the CI, which is mainly, I think, the GitHub Actions source code as well. So you've got those different places that you can go to dig in a little bit further. However, it is 2025, so what we really probably should be doing is trying to do our best to use AI for this. So what I've actually done is, if you go to, and I've put the URL here, and I will actually, let me just drop out of this so I can grab it and paste it to you also in the chat as well. Bear with me 1 second. And let me go back. So that www.gitpod.io/dev-container/docs. What that effectively is a full excerpt of the dev container docs that I put into a gist this morning. And what you can do is take that, and if you're using ChatGPT or Claude or some type of tool like that, you can go ahead and grab that, put that into your chat tool, and then you can use it throughout as I'm going through this session, even to actually chat with the documentation, ask clarifying questions. Of course, we can do this the old school way and throw it in the Zoom chat as well. But that's just a great way to get yourself unblocked. The second thing that I would suggest as well is actually put that inside of or on top of your local machine, because what you can then do is, if you're using an AI tool, AI editor like Cursor or Copilot, something like this, what you can then do is reference that, right? So when you're giving prompts to your AI tool, you can also pass that in the dev container full documentation context, which is really useful, especially if you're seeing, let's say, any errors when you're trying to build your dev container today, or building that config would suggest that. So go ahead and download that file and either throw it into one of your chat tools or store it on your machine as well, and we can use that as we go through. Right, so that's enough sort of introduction. Let's actually jump into the specifics of dev container then. So we talked about it as being this way that we can start to solve the works of my machine problem through images, but what are the specific components that exist within dev container? So I've created this little diagram that kind of breaks it down, and at the foundational level at the bottom, we really have this dev container.json specification. That's the core of everything that we're going to be looking at today, and that's where all of your configuration goes. We'll talk about exactly where that file needs to live and how that's structured. Then on top of that, we have a VS Code extension and dev container. Now, I say VS Code, but the dev container spec is open. So if you're using JetBrains, the other IDEs, these are also integrated. For the purpose of today's workshop, I'm going to scope it just to VS Code to simplify. But there are a number of different tools that are built on top of it. Obviously, because this is coming from Microsoft, VS Code ecosystem is very deeply integrated and has a very sort of first-class experience with dev containers, but it does work with any other tool that has chosen to adopt it, including JetBrains and the other IDEs, I'm sure, as well. Then if we look on top of that, what we have is some of the main core features of dev container is base images, of course. So the core image that the dev container is built on, that is your runtime, that's your tools, your languages, your packages, things like that. And that's all based off of Docker. So it's reusing the Docker actual CLI under the hood. And we'll show how that works in just a second. And then on top of that, we also have features. Now, I've grouped these closely together because they are actually very closely related. Now, when I say features, I don't mean features of Dev Container. It's slightly confusing. It has this feature called features. And features is almost like a replacement for aspects of what Docker is doing. It works well with Docker. It's integrated into Docker, but it packages up certain things that you might use Docker for and simplifies it. It's a little bit hard to explain. You have to see how it works, but once you see it in practice, it's actually very, very powerful. It's probably my favorite feature of dev containers is the features functionality. So definitely worth checking that out. And that sort of extends and builds on some of your base images. But then in terms of other configurations, what we've got is effectively ports, sort of port forwarding. If you've got an application running on a specific port or a database, things like that, you can port it out from the container onto your local machine. This obviously works by default if you're working outside of a container, but it's just a nice added feature that you don't have to tinker with too much of the ports configurations. Extensions and editor extensions. So this is editor settings. So everything from language configurations, like preferences for your languages, for TypeScript, for Python, for Ruby, but extensions. So if you want to install Python extensions, if you want to install Terraform, linters and formatters, and this is really nice because it means that you can start to optimize that developer experience for each of your individual projects and really start to refine it. So everyone else on your team gets the same set of extensions. And this works really nicely with the dev container because your container launches with your preferred extensions from your host, like from your machine, but you can also set them for the container and they just exist within the lifetime of that project. So if you want some really niche extension for one project and not for another, this is really nice for that as well. Life cycles are things, like launching your sort of web servers, databases, processes that you want to start up when your dev container starts up. And then finally, of course, environment variables for sort of configuring different pieces of config for your application as well. Thank you very much, Alan, for dropping those links into the chat. That's useful as well. Yeah, definitely check out containers.dev as we go through. Definitely want to have that open. So what I'm going to do is actually, if you see in the top right here, so you can see the anatomy sort of diagram here. And I'm going to go through some of these different pieces and actually show you a little bit more in detail what they actually do. So let's have a look at first at the sort of core structure of the dev container itself. So what we've got is basically our image, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So Microsoft have published language-specific images. So those exist for a lot of the mainstream languages, and we'll talk about where you can find them. Underneath that, we have some features, and like I mentioned, features are integrated into Docker, and they sort of replace installing specific things inside of your image. So a lot of the images are language based. So let's say if you want to install a database, maybe some Kubernetes commands, things like that. Features are really where that comes in. So you can see here we're actually installing Git and things like that into the container, or for instance, the GitHub CLI. GitHub CLI, if you're not familiar, does things like pull requests, and it's kind of like a replacement for sort of the GitHub UI, but you can actually do that via the CLI. Then underneath that, we've got a number of different customizations. These are broken down by the individual tools. Obviously, here we have VS Code. In that, we have like our different settings. So these are actually your VS Code sort of user settings, just like you would set on your machine, but you can set them for your dev container. And then you can also configure any extensions, so specific extensions to the application. Then we have ports, and we'll get a little bit more into the details of port configuration, and then sort of setup commands as well. So in this case, where you might start up a web server or database. So Bran asks, can dev containers be used with Killer Coda? What is Killer Coda? That's my first question, actually. The name rings a bell. Is that like some sort of learning application for, let me just have a look, interactive environments? It's kind of like a Kubernetes learning environment sort of playground, isn't it? I think. I'm not super familiar. Maybe someone else in the chat will know and maybe can answer that. If it can run Linux itself, it quite possibly could run dev containers if it can run sort of Docker. then it's possible as well, but I'm not super familiar enough to be able to answer that directly, but maybe someone else can. So you've got your dev container JSON. We talked a little bit about this, so some of the integration. So one thing to bear in mind is the location. So when you're using this with VS Code, VS Code does expect the dev container to exist in a certain place, and that's either dev container.json at root or dev container as a directory and then dev container.json underneath. It is possible to store your dev container at different locations, but for instance, the VS Code implementation doesn't support custom paths. So that would mean you could have to launch dev container via the CLI and then connect to it separately, which is a little bit more fiddly. It's not impossible, but it's a little bit more fiddly. So you can do that. Generally speaking, though, what that means is probably better just to store it in the default location, unless you've got sort of a strong reason for installing it somewhere else as well. Okay, so moving on. So we've got that dev container. First thing that we were going to want to do in installing that is our base image. So like I mentioned, Microsoft has all of these different language-based images, but then you're going to have to build your tools on top of that. There are a couple of different ways to integrate with your base image. The most simple way to take an existing built hosted image by Microsoft. That means then you're going to get all the packages that they've installed. That's updated by them, so it's secure. That's being patched frequently as well, which is also quite nice, and you don't have to manage that. But let's say that you want to actually then install some custom tools. You can do that through a Docker file. What effectively here, so this is not very obvious, but if you see here, it's got build and Docker file. This is actually a file path. So that Docker file can actually live anywhere, and then you can just reference that Docker file. It's very common, again, for this to live inside of the .dev container directory. So you've got the Docker file directly next to your dev container. And that is a very pure Docker file as you would write any other. So all of the Docker files, the docs and instructions are exactly the same for that. And then finally, common questions usually about Docker Compose does also work with dev containers, so you can run multiple containers. The only thing to consider here is within your dev container settings, you're then going to have to specify the specific service. So obviously within Docker Compose, you're going to launch multiple containers. So then you just need to tell your dev container which specific service in that configuration you want to connect to, which is the one that you're actively developing on, maybe that be your front end or your back end. For this, you might want to have multiple different configurations so you can swap between them. But yeah, so the question is from Sedan is, can you have user-specific config that's different from team dev container, e.g. a dev wants Vim bindings without other dev struggle and how to edit Vim? Yeah, it's a great question. What I would suggest is that the beauty of the dev container is actually just have different configurations. We'll show how you can launch from those in a second, but I would suggest actually just to have different configurations. You could store them in the repository. It really depends. I know some people don't necessarily like always sharing their preferences, but I would have different configurations. If you have very specific ones, then I mean, you can create those and actually then just overwrite some of the default settings. There isn't, to my knowledge, a way of extending those automatically for your individual user other than overwriting it. But again, maybe there's someone in the chat that knows actually a secret way of doing that that I'm not aware of. But let's just go back here, just double check we've crossed off everything. So yep, we got these three different ways of running an image: hosted images, Docker files, or Docker Compose. That can be pulled from the Microsoft images. And yes, that just means we can start to pin some of our versions as well. When we get into the hands-on stuff, I will share these slides actually as a PDF in the chat, so you have it as well. And I'll share some of these links. But you can either go to Docker Hub and actually see the Microsoft images there, or if you go into the Dev Containers organization inside of their images repo, you can see the list of them in there as well. Right, so that covers off those two. Let's jump into life cycles. So life cycles are when you've got your images and your tools set up. If you were to launch that container, all you would get is a container with your languages and stuff installed in it, but nothing necessarily would run your application or database or something like that. What your lifecycle hooks then is give you an ability to run those, whether that be actually building your application and running it like in this example, like a database migration or seeding and setup. And those run on different life cycles within the container. There's quite a few of these, and they're a little bit nuanced. But generally speaking, you'll probably just want to use these two here, which is basically the on create and post create. On create is literally when you're actually creating the dev container itself, and post create is then actually every time you're starting it and running it. You probably won't need too many of the others unless you're doing something particularly niche. But there is a lot of different lifecycle hooks that you can use for a lot of different scenarios. So I've got just a bit of an overview here. So you got one for creation, post start, and post attach. When we get into the into the hands-on, one thing I will say, sometimes it can be a bit confusing about whether or not your scripts have actually run. One thing that I just suggest is just run the dev container rebuild. I'll show you how to do that in a second, but just rerun the dev container rebuild if you're seeing, your changes are not actually reflected from your configuration as well. It's just an easy way to get out of understanding which of these have actually run. Cool. So I mentioned features a little bit ago. They're kind of built on and around Docker tools. I've actually included this here in bold because this is the way I think you should be thinking about features is you almost always want to bias towards using a feature. So rather than creating a custom Docker file or installing manually by like apt-get or this kind of thing, if there is a feature existing for that particular tool that you want to install, I generally would recommend doing that. It's simpler in your configuration, it's less things to update, and it's a lot cleaner. But it is a little bit confusing because you do have to then go and have a look through the features. You can find the list of features actually as well also on the dev container website as well. There's actually a tab for features. And if you downloaded the documentation that I've sent you, and then you've installed that into your editor, it's already got the list of features in there as well, so it will know what exists already. But if we just take a look at a few of these examples, for instance, just to make this a little bit more concrete. So once you take, let's say, one of the base images, it could just be a basic language one. So you could take Python, but then you might have other tools in there that you want, like Go or Rust. And what you can do is you can layer those on through features. So adding additional languages is sort of one of the core use cases for that. Then, like I said before, you've got GitHub tools. You can even, kubectl and container orchestration tools, some sort of command line utilities. But very common things like cloud CLIs and databases as well. Of course, if it doesn't exist in the registry of features, then you can install it yourself manually. But I would certainly first default to actually looking to see if a feature exists for what you're trying to install. Features themselves can also be created. We won't cover that today in this workshop, but if you wanted to create one for your own organization, you could do. And that's a really nice way of distributing packages within inside your organization. If you want to, if your platform is kind of composable, is plug and play, you can actually expose those through features as well and actually install them in your dev container. So Brian asked the question, is dev container an orchestration tool in like Kubernetes? Great question. The answer is no. So dev container is really only about running a single container that you're attached to. You can run multiple and then attach to one. However, that said, there are ways you can actually attach to other running containers inside of Kubernetes as well. It's not something that we're going to touch on in this session, but I'll show you how you can do that as well when we get into the live demo. And if that's something that you're using, if you're using Kubernetes as well in higher environments, you can actually use dev container tooling to connect to those containers as well, which is quite nice. The reason for that is actually dev container is also built on top of what is effectively called the remote development or the remote SSH sort of extensions, which allows you to, within VS Code and other tools, to connect to a remote running environment. So kind of the composition of those two utilities actually makes for a really powerful developer experience because you can connect also up to remote containers as well, which is really cool. Okay, so moving on, so we've got VS Code extensions and settings. This is quite straightforward, I think, which is you can basically just plug in your extensions inside of the dev container spec. Also not to be overlooked is also you can set your user settings as well, right? So if you want to set preferences for like, language settings or even just like how the editor itself behaves, you can do that as well. But remember, that's also scoped within each of the editors as well. So you see this in this VS Code block as well. So these are all the settings for VS Code, and then it'll be the same for JetBrains and for other IDs as well underneath. I think this is pretty straightforward. So I think good enough to jump ahead to the next one. I think ports are also fairly straightforward. You just basically mention those in your config. Any ports you want to forward from your web servers or databases, that will then automatically get forwarded and started as well. You've got a few different additional attributes you can add on there. One thing that's quite nice as well is I think you have some of these behaviors for instance, when you port forward, you can say like notify and even open browser. By open browser, it actually opens a simple browser inside of VS Code. So if you've got a web app or something like that, you can actually launch that by default, which is nice as a general onboarding experience. If you've got an application or something with a front end or documentation you want to load by default, you can do that using that setting, which is quite nice. What you can also do is suppress ports as well. So if you don't want those ports to be shown inside of your configuration, you can suppress them if you want them just to sort of exist in the background. Maybe it's something to do with logs or something like that that you think is just a bit noisy and you want to suppress as well. Okay, so last few things before we actually jump into the demo. So I want to talk about the dev container CLI. So there is also a CLI for dev container. You can install this and play around with this today if you want, but this is primarily, and it's important to think about it more to do with sort of your CI and CD. So like I mentioned before, there are a few cases locally where you might want it. For instance, you want to store your dev container in a different location. You could use the dev container CLI for that. I personally find the experience a little bit more clunky than if you're just using the VS Code extension, but you can do. But the primary use for this is really inside of CI and automation. So let's say within your CI build, you want to run your dev container and validate it just to ensure that it's always working, just so you have a common check. So every pull request that's made, you want to just make sure that your dev container still compiles and everything works. You can do that. And also you can run your CI on top of it. Let's say you want to run your unit tests. You can reuse your existing image that you've already built for local to run your automation tests inside of CI, and you could use a dev container CLI for that. And then there's also a very handy GitHub action, which effectively is just calling the CLI under the hood for you, but just gives you some nice semantics for running that in the GitHub action and just reuses that base image configuration as well, which is really useful. And finally, just mentioning, I suppose, is you can use this as a reference implementation. So like Brandon mentioned, is this used for orchestration? Well, not necessarily out of the box, but let's say that you wanted to build your own sort of dev container orchestration service internally into your own platform. You could do that with the dev container CLI. So you could build that orchestration yourself. And this is used primarily by vendors. So like the company that I work for, Gitpod, we use dev container CLI for orchestrating Gitpod dev environments. So that asked as well, is Cursor supported? So I actually tried this out before the workshop, and it seems to work fine for me. I know there's a GitHub issue open within Cursor's repo about this not working well with Cursor, but it works for me today. So it seems to work just fine. So I think you should be okay using Cursor. For those, I suppose, are not aware, obviously, Cursor is a fork of VS Code. So it takes the underlying base code from VS Code. So by virtue, it makes it easy to work with VS Code related things. But from what I understand, I think Cursor is still lagging behind on that fork. I think it's a couple of months out of date. So I think there are a few bugs on some features around things like dev container and remote. But I tried it this morning, it did work. So give it a spin today and let me know if it works for you as well. If you have any issues, we can debug them. One thing with the dev container CLI that I didn't mention here is also pre-build support. So one thing you can do is use the CLI for building your images. And that's useful for not having your developers have to rebuild their images locally. If there's not a locally built image that exists for them, obviously that developer's then going to have to rebuild it on their machine. What you can do, especially have a lot of developers using a dev container, you can just build that in CI, push it to your own container registry, and then your dev container can use that for base images, which just speeds things up. It might take maybe it could even be 5 times faster to load like that. So if you're pushing a lot of changes or your dev container is changing a lot, you might want to do this. There are some scenarios where you might want to pre-build that as well. Cool. So let me know if there's any other questions, drop those in the chat. If not, I'm actually just going to show you literally how this works. As I go through this, feel free to stop me or drop any questions. We can have a look at some of the different workflows that were mentioned. But otherwise, I'll give you a quick demo, make this real, and then I'll hand over to you, and we can actually then get started and actually then get hands on ourselves as well. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and then swap over to another one to actually show you this as well. So let me just double check. Do you see my other screen? You should see my second desktop. Let's have a look. Yes, you do. Thank you, Sedans. This is really useful. Wonderful. So, right, so near where I live, there is a very nice walk. They call it the Cotswolds Way. So it's the Cotswolds, and there is a long sort of 60, 70 kilometer walk that goes through it. So I made myself my own little application the other day to actually track my progress through this walk, so I could mark in different GPS coordinates and track that. So the example I'm actually just going to show you here today is using that. So that application is very simple. I deliberately built it very simple, so it's a good example for dev container. So So let me just make this a little bit bigger so you can see this on my screen. And what I'm going to do is I've got the code CLI installed on my machine. If you have VS Code downloaded, I think the command is, I have a look in here, install, yeah, so there you go. If you have VS Code installed and you don't have the code command on your CLI, if you go into the command palette, you have this install code command in path. That just gives you this code command on your terminal. You don't need it because you can launch dev containers through the extension view, but I just find it quite useful when you're navigating around via terminal because you can write code and then you give it the context and it will open up VS Code for you. So let's go ahead and do that and launch up with VS Code. And what you'll see quickly before it disappears is down here in the corner, we have this folder contains a dev container configuration, which it does. So I can reopen that inside of my dev container. Now, critically, obviously, when I've started VS Code, it's not already running in a container. So I've just got my source code here. The best way to see that inside of VS Code is if you look down here in the bottom left, you have this little green bar. Now, this little green bar will tell you if you're connected up to a remote container or a container that's running dev container on your machine. So that's kind of like your status. So when VS Code comes up, you want to have a look down here and just see if you're already running in a container or not. Now that notification has just disappeared, so I'll bring it back, and you see you've got a few different options here. So I've got reopening container, cloning volume, and obviously don't show again. If I click reopening container, that's the basic setup for you. What that basically does is then launches your container, builds it, and then actually then mirrors your source code with your container. If you click cloning volume, that actually does the clone inside of it. So the difference between these two options is that cloning volume puts the source code inside of the container and not necessarily on your file system where you've stored it already. So it's going to reclone that. What that means is if you delete and remove that container, the source code is gone. Now, that's obviously a greater degree of isolation if that's what you're after for whatever you're doing. But also that just means you have to be careful making sure you're committing it because that the source code is also then contained inside the container. So what I'm going to do right now is actually just click on this one to reopen a container, which is the sort of simple view. But later on, if you want to have a go with the cloning option, you'll need to actually set up some authentication with Git as well for that to work. Now, what I'm going to do is quickly show you my dev container config here. So a very simple one. So I'm actually using the actual existing Microsoft dev container and I'm using Python 3. I have a very simple command, which is running my Python web server, and I'm going to forward port 8000. Now, when you actually modify this, if I go ahead and change it, you'll notice also you get this option to rebuild. Now, if in doubt, you just want to rebuild your container because if you're not seeing changes reflected or if you change something and something's not working, what I suggest is just rebuild from scratch, and it will help you just get back to a normal state. If you go as well into the command palette, if I go to dev containers, you also get this here as well. So you got rebuild here. You've got it all times. You can always grab that if you need to. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that just to rebuild my container and start essentially from scratch. What you see down here is all of my logs related to that dev container startup. And then over in the left-hand side here, I've also got my ports that are actually forwarding. So I forwarded port 8000, which is where my web server is running. And in fact, let me just quickly show you that start server script so you can see that as well. And which is essentially this Python 3 server py. And inside of my server is where I'm defining the port for that as well. So let me close some of these. And then obviously, if I click on that for the port, I get my preview. Let's see if this should launch. Sometimes it can take a second just to pull this up. And there we go. Here's my running application on inside of my dev container. And here is the Cotswolds way. So if we close that down now, just quickly so you see that, within the ports here, you've got this little globe here. That basically means opening your browser to see your preview. Sometimes what you might find is that your server has stopped. Let's say if I actually just manually stop this here, you'll see this little green port here go neutral again. If you start the server again, it will get picked up inside of the ports view. If you can't remember what you did, just run a rebuild, and I'll actually just rebuild your container and then start you from scratch, and everything should be back up and running. And that's the whole benefit of the dev container. Simple, ephemeral, you throw it away. If you break anything, it comes back for you. Now, one thing I just want to show you here is if I go back to my terminal and I go in here and I run docker ps-a, which is a shorthand for docker process all. And let me just make that a bit smaller because I want to try and get this all on one line so it's a bit easier to read. And then what we'll see is the container is running. And that's the container that's running my application right now. So generally speaking, you probably won't need to mess too much with Docker itself. If you're familiar, this will be fine. You'll understand a lot of what's going on here. But through the dev container extension, it's actually managing a lot of this for you under the hood, so you don't need to worry about it too much. But it's important to know that this is where your containers are actually running. If you're using Docker Desktop, you'll see these containers running in there as well. If I go ahead and actually then just stop this running container, we'll see how that behaves inside of VS Code. So if I stop that and go back into VS Code, obviously my container is no longer working, so it can't connect. I can obviously cancel out of this. It will remove me from the dev container session. Or if I go ahead and click reload, this is nice because that is actually then under the hood restarting that Docker container for me as well. So if I go back here and see Docker start again, now we see that obviously the container has come up more recently than last time. So those are pretty much the raw basics using VS Code. For this workshop, I would suggest that you try and use VS Code. It's got the deepest integration. And just checking the questions, but I think they're a little bit old. And yes, so VS Code is really has the deepest integration. I would suggest using that for this session. If you are a JetBrains kind of person, you can try it if you want, or you could do that afterwards as well. But let me now swap back over to my slides because I've got a few instructions on there as well for the exercise. And let me go ahead and share this. And you should see as well some installation steps. So what I'll do now is hand over back to you. I will stop talking for a little bit and let you go ahead and install any tools that you need. After that, what I would suggest that we do is we'll move into this, which is the setting about those basic properties. So if you have already got everything installed and you want to get started, feel free to just go ahead and actually start creating yourself an initial dev container JSON. Go and install one of the individual language images. Start, just try opening that inside of VS Code, get used to opening and closing it. Maybe you want to try the dev container CLI as well, but just go ahead and get those installed. And then I will come back and be with you as well in 10 minutes. If you get stuck with anything, drop it in the chat. It is now where I am, it's 4:40. So we'll sort of come back and try and proceed on in about 5 or 10 minutes. So around sort of 45, 50, we will continue through. So go ahead and get that stuff installed if you've not already on your machine, and we'll continue through after that. So whilst you're going through and setting that up, what I'm going to do is actually, I've pasted this one about the OWASP juice shop. So I'm actually going to share my screen as I go through this one. Now, if you try and configure it myself. So it's up to you. You can follow along, or you can actually go ahead and do this yourself. Remember what I've pasted in also the PDF also into the chat if you want to jump back to any particular slide, if that's helpful to go back and have a look at some of the other instructions. But otherwise, I'm going to swap and share my other screen and then actually go through a real world example and see if we can get this juice shop example actually working as well. So I'll just give a quick update of the changes that I'm making on my side. So I'm actually using Cursor here, which is an AI editor. I don't know if anyone's using that. I think Siddhant is trying as well. But basically, what I've done so far is actually for this project. So this is the open source project called Juice Shop. It had an existing dev container, but it was broken because there wasn't even an image property in there, so that was never going to work from the start. I did ask Cursor just to give me an initial scaffolding. I'm just going through and tidying that up right now. One of the first things that I noticed is the setup script that it gave me wasn't using any of the features like I mentioned before. So that's one of the things that I'm going to do first is actually swap some of those because if we install packages directly in this script, they're not going to get cached. Whereas if we use the features, they're going to get cached. So every time we start or rebuild our container now, it's going to reuse effectively the Docker layers, which will mean that I get a much faster startup as opposed to using ad hoc scripts. The other thing as well is it also did not include a script example was just saying, run these steps manually, but I don't want to do that. I do want the app actually to run by default. But then I'm just going to go through and tidy up some other bits now as well, including that script. It seems that it's automatically added me also a dev server by the looks of it, which seems like I don't need it. It looks like what it's actually running by default is actually the entire sort of front end and back end, because actually when I use the application now, it seems to be running just fine. So I've got that now up and running, and when I sort of start it and have a look, I'm also getting requests off to what looks like it is to the back end as well. I've got these API requests here, and that seems to be mapping through to localhost 3000, and it seems like the back end, the REST server, is actually running just on the same port. So I don't think I need anything else. So I might tidy up the config a little bit further, but just wanted to share that as well. Again, feel free to watch along on my side or on your side, and if you have any questions, drop them in the chat as well. No, Mike, I think your machine's probably okay. Right, so it is coming up a little bit fast approaching to time. So what I'm going to do is just quickly run you through the changes that I've made on this project, and hopefully you've made some changes also in your own. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat, and then we'll basically start doing some wrap up as well. So like I mentioned, so this is for the Juice Shop application. And what I'll do is actually push this to my fork after this because I just need to authenticate with GitHub as well. Don't need to do anything with that. Just close that. What I've got in here is a simple setup script. I've got my dev container set up using a number of the different features, which is nice. So we've got TypeScript, Angular, etc. A number of different extensions that I'll just double check about these afterwards as well. And then check through the settings. We've got then port 3000 is pushing, which is good because also my setup script seems like it's building both the front end and the back end, and then it's able to serve it, and then we're able to just start that, which is nice because then I actually have now my running application on port 3000, which is great. So that's now working here, and that is a good example, I guess, of also configuring an unknown project, in this case, OWASP for me. But let me just go ahead and actually jump back into the slides, and we'll go through a few additional sort of wrap-up things as well before we close out. So let me share a different screen. Right, so in the PDF that I've shared, also if you want to, I'm also in the Platform Engineering Slack. If you're not already in there, feel free to drop in there and you can find me as well. Feel free to drop me a message in there, tag me as well if you want to. But inside the PDF, there's also an additional step as well for applying to your own configuration to your own repository. But let's just briefly, in the last couple of minutes, then we can talk about how to sort of take Dev Container a little bit further, even with CDEs, which are effectively automated development environments that build on top of tools like Dev Container as well. So just quickly then, so what is a CDE and what does that do on top of Dev Container? So as we've seen today, Dev Container is really having all of those setup steps for your dev environment automated and configured and ready to go. However, all of that is still happening in your machine. And like we had the question also from Siddhant about orchestration, Dev Container doesn't necessarily orchestrate any of this for you. A CDE then actually does. So a CDE in terms of infrastructure can give you an orchestration layer on top of your Dev containers, gives you audit logs. It can run even inside of your own private networks. Those dev containers, rather than running on your own machine, can actually run inside of your network. I think we had the same problem here today as well. Let me just have a quick look through the chat who it was. I can't remember. Someone having permissions issues on their machine. Well, that's where something like a CDE comes in, because you have that running securely in your environment, and then you're decoupling the dev environment itself from your own individual machine. It's kind of like having a dev container supercharge on running inside your own infrastructure. Because you have that, then you have access to all of these other things as well. So for instance, you can automate in secrets, registry, Git integration, you can apply security policies, get analytics, and even do things like caching, because obviously on your machine, if you want to do things like pre-builds, those pre-builds have to be set up and configured also with your dev container. If you have a platform that's orchestrating this for you, it can do all of that for you. But that's very much the architecture level perspective. With tools like Gitpod and tools that are CDEs, basically what you can get on top of a dev container is things like performant environments. So you can run your dev container and actually go ahead and get different machine sizes. For instance, you can get large machines, access to GPU, and run those dev containers actually on top of cloud environments as well. That gives you the ability to also centralize those. So the configurations, for instance, within Gitpod and some other CDs are a little bit different, but we have also an automation configuration file, which builds on top of dev container and adds an additional set of power. And if you're a platform team, you can use automations effectively to centralize even more of the automation on your dev environment, so that everyone inside of your organization is getting the same tooling and everything's pre-installed. Like the base images we saw today in dev container, you can configure those centrally, so you can configure and manage those in a central location. In addition to that, you can run this stuff within your network, which is security. Tools, especially Gitpod as well, we work very well and actually work the best with regulated companies, so banks, pharmaceutical, and healthcare. And the reason for that is security. So things like policies you can set up on top of those dev containers to make sure that the individual developers inside your organization are doing things aligned with your security and even your platform policies and standards as well. One final thing I do want to just mention is, so Gitpod even has, so a lot of the stuff that we did today was actually going through and setting up a dev container manually. For our enterprise customers, we actually have a coding agent, of which we even have an agent that does the setup environment for you. So your dev environment inside of the Gitpod product, when you're using dev environments through Gitpod, can actually automate your setup, can automate the configuration of your dev environment. When you start a new dev environment inside of Gitpod, you get this little chat window comes up on the right-hand side, asks you if you want to automatically configure that. And then Owner, which is our AI software engineering agent, will actually then configure that for you. So you don't even need to do the setup yourself. It will take the first pass at it for you as well. So there we have it. That's obviously a quick run through of Dev Container. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the Dev Container standard. I have shared through the PDF. I'll be in the Slack channel. I'll share also the PDF in there so you've got it if you need it later. Someone asked this as well, but the talk as well is being recorded and will be published on the Platform Engineering YouTube channel, along with all the other talks. All the virtual talks are already up there as well, and I believe these will be up in the next couple of weeks. But if you want to chat in the Slack, we can as well. Then the final thing I just want to mention is we recently launched owner.com, which is effectively our secure privacy-first software engineering agent. Runs autonomously, and it means you can run agents in the background in parallel securely inside of your network, built on top of environments that are automated with Dev Container as well. So if you liked some of the stuff that you're seeing here with Dev Container, you want to really supercharge that, think it might work well for your organization, head over to owner.com and then you can sign up for that. It's currently in early access for some of our design partners, but we will certainly open this up to the wider public a little bit later in the year as well. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. Really hope you have a great weekend.